registrars and servers and web hosts. Oh my, if you have never thought about how a website works, you'd be forgiven. But before you start your next web project, I want to share a little bit about how the internet works, so that way when we're asking you for technical information, you know what it is, where to find it, and why it matters. So let's dive into how a website works. Hi, I'm Jesse from Super Web Pros, and the first concept I want to share is what's called the request response cycle. So at a fundamental level, the request response cycle refers to any time a user requests information from the internet, they receive a response back from the internet with the information that they're looking for. Very simple so far. I go to www.superwebpros.com. I'm making a request to the internet, and it's going to return whatever that web page is at www.superwebpros.com. The whole internet essentially is functioning around this request response cycle in order to help individuals find what they're looking for and receive what they're looking for. But the reality is that all of this is happening with a lot of infrastructure under the hood in order to make it very easy for you as a user to go in and type www.somewebsite.com to be able to get that information back. So let's look at what's actually happening under the hood when this request response cycle is going on. Okay, to make this simple, let's think about the real world before we dive into the techie stuff. Okay, let's imagine that you want to come and visit Super Web Pros at our office. So you go to Google Maps and you start typing Super Web Pros, and you see an address start to pop up, and you click on the address, and the address will now show you where our office is in space. Okay, so what did we do? We went over here, we started typing in an address, and in typing in that address, Google Maps underneath the hood mapped that name to a physical address that exists somewhere in the world, in this case in East Lansing, Michigan. And then it shows us where in the physical world that building is, so that if you want to come and visit us at our office, this is where you need to go in order to find us. Now, underneath the hood, the internet works very, very similarly. So let's imagine that now, instead of going to Super Web Pros in Google Maps, I'm going to www.somewebsite.com. And of course, I'm entering that into what's called a browser. And that browser could be Chrome, it could be Firefox, it could be Safari, whatever it is. And somewhere under the hood, there is a registrar, or there is a DNS server rather, that is looking to match that somewebsite.com to its server address that exists somewhere on the internet. So in the same way that Super Web Pros exists at a physical address in space, every website lives at a digital address somewhere on the internet. So your registrar, wherever it was that you bought your www.somewebsite.com, is essentially registering or that particular name. So in the same way that we registered Super Web Pros, right? They're registering website.com as an entity that can be found in the internet. And then the DNS host is matching where that entity lives on the internet, or where that entity actually lives on the internet. Now, instead of us having a geography, in this case, a building where we live, or where we work rather, along the street in East Lansing, on the internet, that's happening on a server or a web host. In the same way that we've got an address, 325 East Grand River Avenue, every single website lives at a server address, but instead of 325 East Grand River Avenue, it's 127.0.0. whatever it is. Right? Now, I don't even remember my own phone number. I have Siri there to be able to match names to phone numbers. If we had to remember 127.0.0. blah, blah, blah for every single website, we'd go crazy, right? So the DNS host takes care of this problem by matching somewebsite.com to that server address 127.0. blah, 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 so we don't have to remember that. Now, once that matching happens, and this is all happening in the split seconds, milliseconds, once that matching happens, that request from the user through the browser gets filtered to the appropriate host. So in the same way that I look up Super Web Pros over here, and now I know and I can click driving directions, that request has gone through the DNS host to a web host, so that way the internet, which has all this information stored on the server, can now generate the response, which is that web page, back to the client. Now, I say the response is a web page. In reality, your web host is doing a couple of different things. So in the same way that our physical office might have multiple rooms and, we've got a conference room, we've got offices, we've got whatever, in the same way that our physical office might have different elements to it, so that if, depending on when you come in, you might end up in one or more rooms for different reasons, your web host has multiple websites on it in most cases. And so you can think of your web host essentially like an apartment complex. You've got a big plot of land, and your website is taking up one of the blocks in that big sort of plot of digital land. Now, depending on the website, your information might be stored in files or in a database. If you're using a typical WordPress type of install, generally speaking, your website information lives inside of a database, which is inside of the overall web host / server environment. You might also have files, PDF files or something like that, or image files, which also exist in the server environment. And so when somebody is making a request for your website, www.somewebsite.com, through their browser, underneath the hood, a DNS host is matching that name to a digital address, which is typically going to be a server. And that server is typically going to have a file structure and potentially a database. And so when that request comes in, it's going to look for the appropriate data in the appropriate place. And again, that's outside the scope. How that all works is outside the scope of this video. It's going to find that information and say, all right, somebody was requesting somewebsite.com. Let's go look up all the pictures associated with somewebsite.com. Let's get all the code generated for somewebsite.com. And then let's send it back through the browser so the person who makes the request is able to see that information now on the browser. Now, just looking at this, you can already start to see why some things, like for instance, where your web server is placed relative to your traffic, or how big your database is, or how many files you've got, can really impact things like your website performance. For instance, the more information that has to come back through this pipe, right? Say you've got big files or big images, the longer it's going to take for this request response cycle to take. The further this web host is from the requester, potentially, the longer it's going to take for that request to take. And there's a whole lot of other technical things that can influence that. But these very simple diagram, somebody makes a request in the same way that I go looking for information, that gets mapped to an address. In the real world, that address is a physical place. In the digital world, that address is a computer. And once that process happens, that information is able to get found on the computer and then returned back through the client, so that way the person looking for the internet or looking for that web page on the internet is able to get what they're looking for. Now, what does this mean for you when you're doing your own projects? So typically what we're going to need access to is your registrar, which is the name you bought. So typically it's going to be like GoDaddy, Bluehost, something like that. It's where you bought the name, somewebsite.com, which is what registered that name on the internet. In the same way that we register Super Web Pros with all the relevant legal authorities, you register your website name with the internet so that way it's able to be found. We will typically also need access to your web host, which is where your website currently lives. If you bought your website, let's say GoDaddy, and you just hosted your website on GoDaddy, it's the same place. In some cases, though, you might have moved your website to a web host, and there's a lot of good reasons to do that. And so we would need access to the digital real estate, to the server environment that your website currently lives in, or at least elements of the server environment, so we can grab information off of your current plot of real estate and put it in the plot of real estate where we are working for you now. Now, in some cases, some rarer cases, your DNS host and your web host might not be on the same place. For instance, we set up almost all of our websites on something called Cloudflare for a variety of reasons, for security, performance, etc. And so if you're working with us, your DNS host might be Cloudflare, your web host might be WP Engine, and your registrar might be GoDaddy, which means you bought the name somewebsite.com at GoDaddy. We are filtering all requests through Cloudflare to give you better performance and security, but we have the website hosted at WP Engine where it's optimized for all of this part to happen very, very quickly. So that way when somebody comes to your website, they're able to find it very quickly and receive that information very quickly because all the infrastructure underneath the hood is optimized for speed, performance, and security. But those three things, your registrar, your DNS host, and your web host, are typically the three most techie things that we'll need access to whenever we're working on a website project. And if you're not working with us, there's a good chance that any developer you're working with is going to need access to at least those three things. In most cases, it'll just be a registrar and web host. But if you've ever worked with a developer who is using Cloudflare or some other tool like Cloudflare, your DNS host would be a very close third. Whew! So that was a lot in a very short period of time. The key things to remember are your registrar is where you register your name, subwebsite.com. Your web host is the digital real estate that your website lives in. And in many cases, those two things will start out being the same thing, though they don't always need to be. In some rare cases, your DNS host might be different than your registrar and your web host, but all three play a really important role in making sure people are able to type your website in a way that they can read and understand, for the internet to find where in the world that website exists and return it back so that way the content that you have can be found. If this is still confusing to you, don't worry, it can get pretty technical pretty quickly. But if you're in the middle of a project or you're getting ready to start a web project and you're not sure what all this stuff is and you would really like some help, please take a second to reach out at superwebpros.com and a web pro will be happy to talk with you about your website and your project so that you can get the best performance for your business and your budget. If this video was helpful, please take a second to like or subscribe. If you found it confusing, I'd love to know what you found confusing in the comments, so that way me or somebody from my team can respond and hopefully help clear things up for you. Until next time, thank you for your time and your attention, and we'll see you in the next video.